The Gulf states are reeling. Iran, not content to hit just U.S. military bases in the region, has targeted Gulf hotels, airports, and energy infrastructure. And it says it will further escalate if Gulf leaders cannot rein in Donald Trump. The region's economic lifeline, its oil and gas exports, are squeezed in the east via Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz, and in the west as Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen are striking Saudi tankers in the Red Sea. How do Gulf countries move forward? Joining me to discuss all this is Tariq Masood, the director of Harvard's Kennedy School Middle East Initiative, and Danny Cintronowitz, who served as the head of the Iran branch of Israel's military intelligence. He's now a senior researcher at the Tel Aviv-based Institute for National Security Studies. Danny, let me begin with you. The impasse, before we get to the Gulf, the impasse right now seems to be basically that Iran is insisting that no matter what what the nature of the deal is, they have to have a kind of privileged control over the Strait of Hormuz. They may or may not charge, but that is their discretion. The American position is no, it has to be complete, open, free, unimpeded access. Who is going to give in here?
Farid, thank you for inviting me. And yeah, like you said, there is an impasse. But eventually, I don't think that the Iranians will forgo their control over the Hormuz Straits, even if the US will escalate. So the ball is in the administration court and mainly in President Trump's decision-making process, saying that eventually it can escalate, but no one is securing the fact that Iran will capitulate, or it can eventually allow Iran some sort of a control over the straits. Definitely Iran is allowing to control at least the entrance to the straits, and this is something that Iran is aspiring to. And I think that Washington will have to decide whether to accept it and open the maritime blockade, or actually continuing pressuring Iran, knowing that Iran will retaliate. So I think in the end of the day, it's a simple choice between accepting Iranian control over the straits or escalating into a war that nobody knows how it will end, but definitely it won't bring to the Iranian capitulation.
Tariq, so when you look at the situation in the Gulf, you grew up in Saudi Arabia, you know it well, you've studied it all your life. They had a kind of model, which was the UAE, Qatar, increasingly the Saudis, which is sort of, welcome to Dubai. You know, you're in Switzerland. You're safe, you're secure, you can do all the business you want. How much has this war sort of rattled that whole idea?
Look, I think it's rattled it significantly. If you think about the United Arab Emirates, this was a country that, when I was living in Saudi Arabia in the mid-1980s, nobody would have predicted that this would become sort of the, emblem of openness and modernity that it has become. And, I like to say that the UAE was close to achieving escape velocity from the Middle East. It was a country that many people forgot was located in this pretty troubled region. It's a place that people thought was secure. Expats were making their lives there. And then this war reminded everybody that this region is, as one Saudi commentator recently noted, a jungle. It's a difficult place. And here's the problem. For a long time, in all of these countries, there's always been a camp of foreign policy thinkers that I would call like the American camp, the camp that believes that their future lies in closer ties with the US. And they would always make the argument that this is a difficult region. By bringing the US in, it makes it less difficult, makes it less of a jungle. Well, this recent war, the US has basically been an agent not of order, but of chaos. And so the Gulf countries find themselves really torn between two irrational actors, right? So on the one hand, you have this irrational enemy, but on the other hand, you have an ally that also doesn't look totally rational, that on the one day says they're going to obliterate Iran, the next day says, oh, well, maybe we'll share a control of the Strait of Hormuz between Donald Trump and the mullahs. And so consequently, they are deciding that they need to make other arrangements to plan for a future in which the U.S. isn't actually going to offer them security guarantees. The Gulf countries have different views about how to go about this, but all of them are looking to a post-war order in which they're going to have to do a lot more for themselves.
A post-American Gulf order.
Yeah, post-American world. Yeah.
All right, stay with us. When we come back, I'm going to ask to flesh out exactly what the divisions are between, say, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The U.S. has long been the primary security guarantor for the Gulf nations. Now faced with American unreliability and a war with Iran, Gulf nations are looking for other ways to protect themselves. On Friday in Mecca, Saudi Arabia signed a NATO-style mutual defense pact with Pakistan and Turkey. I'm back with Tariq Masood and Danny Sintrynowicz. Danny, what did you make of this pact? And it does feel like you're now seeing a very clear division. The UAE is backing a kind of Israel-American hardline against Iran, and the Saudis seem to be trying to make, have at least good talks with Iran, and at the same time banding with countries like Turkey, Pakistan, and even Qatar, who were their once enemy, for this more balanced approach where they're saying we're talking to all sides.
Well, definitely. And I think this war against Iran exposed the simple fact that there is no GCC. There are Gulf countries, but they are not united. One hand, you had the Omanis and the Qataris, and a little bit of the Saudis want to interact with the Iranians, understanding that you cannot push Iran into the corner. On the other side, you have UAE and Bahrain that are definitely being supported by Israel and interested in expanding at least the pressure on Iran. And I think it's also returning back to the personality between MBS and NBZ and the bad relations between UAE and Saudi Arabia in general. It's actually highlight another element that countries are not actually relying on the US support. I think the Saudis are quite disappointed, and I think they're feeling exposed to the Iranian and Houthi threat, so they need other elements like the Pakistani, like the Turks to help them. So I think these developments are interesting. It's more or less like the day after the Gulf and the diversification of the security needs for those countries. But at the end of the day, I think that it's all about what will happen if Iran and the Houthis will attack Saudi tomorrow, whether this alliance actually attack in Yemen and Iran, and I have serious doubts about that. But definitely it's a very interesting development that need to be really considered and looking how this actually will evolve into the future.
Tariq, what do you think about this schism between the Saudis and the UAE, and does it speak to a broader issue?
Look, I mean, it's interesting. Danny, I think, is right when he says that the current war reveals that there isn't such a thing as a kind of unified Gulf Cooperation Council position. But I think of this schism, at least with respect to the current war, as being driven less by ideological differences, although there are some, and more by sort of how the U.S. has conducted this war. I think of the Saudis as...
the problem is American unreliability.
Yeah, I think the Saudis are the swing voters, right? The Emiratis and the Bahrainis are very committed, and on the part, and both of them have strong ideological and geopolitical reasons for being committed to going all out against Iran. And then, of course, the Qataris and the Omanis have a fairly different position. The Saudis and the Kuwaitis, to a lesser extent, I think of as the swing voters. Remember, MBS partially created this situation. Remember, this is the guy who told us that Khamenei, the former supreme leader, was the equivalent of Hitler. If the United States had been willing to go in hard and commit troops and basically fulfill the most expansive version of the dream to hit Iran, I think the Saudis would have fallen in line. The fact that the U.S. hasn't done that has caused the Saudis to think, okay, we need to de-escalate, we need to lean into what we did in 2023 when we came to détente with Iran. So I think that's a big driver of what is happening.
So the Saudi sort of view is, either you should have gone in big and destroyed the regime completely, or you should make some accommodation with it.
That's my read, right. Yes. In other words, this is definitely the second best option for them right now. But if the U.S. had been willing to go in big, I think the Saudis would have been there.
Danny, what happens to the Gulf in a situation where Iran and, let's say, Oman have joint control of the Gulf? They may or may not charge for it, but they are clearly seen as the gatekeepers to the Strait of Hormuz. Can the Gulf states live with that?
Definitely, yes. It's not that they like it, but I think that for them, stability is above everything, even above winning against Iran. I think that instability right now causing a major problem for them, especially on the economical side. And I think they need to return back stability, even if the Iranians will have some sort of control over the Hormuz Strait for a temporary time. I think that for them, again, it's not the best solution, but maybe it's the only solution that we have right now just to return back stability, and even more importantly, to prevent an escalation that actually put them in a real risk, given the Iranian threat they're going to attack the energy facilities in those countries. So I think that they don't want to live with that, but they don't have any other choice just to live with that.
Final thought, Saudi normalization with Israel, way on the back burner right now.
Well, President Trump, you saw that in the deal that the United States made with the Saudis to help them with their civilian nuclear program. After the deal was basically done, President Trump came and said, there are two other conditions: no domestic enrichment, and you have to join the Abraham Accords. And it's interesting that the Saudis basically didn't respond to those new conditions at all. They pretended as if the president hadn't said them. Saudis have been very clear.
And a pro-regime commentator said in an article, if you don't give us the enrichment, we will go to the Chinese.
Yes, that's right. I think the Saudis have been very clear. They are open to normalization if the state of Israel is willing to offer a clear set of irrevocable steps to a Palestinian state. We're nowhere near there. And the fact that the Saudis are now allying much more with Turkey, which is a country that what Danny has forgotten about Israel, I haven't learned yet, but so he may disagree. But if you look at Israeli discourse right now, they talk about Turkey as the new enemy. And so here's Saudi Arabia getting further enmeshed with the Turks. Can't be read in Israel as something conducive to normalization between Saudi and Israel.
I saw Danny nodding his head in agreement. So on that note of agreement, we're going to have to leave it. Danny, Tariq, thank you. So smart. The Whiplash War, Operation Boomerang, the Forever Negotiation. These are some of the ways the international media is describing the state of America's volatile conflict with Iran, which seems to lurch between sudden eruptions of fighting and fragile pauses for diplomacy. My next guest has just returned from 10 days inside Iran with a striking account of how that country is responding to the war. Abdi Latif Dahir is a Middle East correspondent for the New York Times. He was granted rare access to report on last month's funeral of Ayatollah Khamenei, the country's former supreme leader, who was killed back in February. Abdi joins me from Beirut. Welcome, Abdi. Let me ask you, you were at a Shia funeral, and in general, the Shia are very big on martyrdom. Did Ayatollah Khamenei's funeral have the air of a kind of search for revenge for a martyr's death?
Yes, thanks for having me, Fareed. Yeah, for sure. There were so many people, millions who came from across the country, who essentially were calling for revenge. They basically were talking about this revered leader, who was central to Iran for almost 40 years. And essentially were calling, their leadership to basically not compromise, not negotiate, essentially to continue this war until his killing, was avenged. And that's definitely a central message that we heard from so many people that we interviewed in the streets of Tehran, but also in Mashhad, the city where Khamenei was born and where he was eventually buried.
But yet, we know that this is a regime that massacred tens of thousands of people, perhaps in a weekend, that is unpopular by many accounts. And you write about this. So what can you tell us about, dissent in Iran? Are there sort of two Irans, an Iran that came out for this funeral and an Iran that is still deeply critical of the government? And can you get a sense of the relative weights of these two Irans?
Absolutely, yeah. We definitely did witness two Irans that were coexisting side by side. Yeah, there was definitely the government that was out here and, projecting defiance and endurance and a lot of strength. But on the flip side of it, yes, there were the other Iran that, where many people talked about the economic hardships that they are going through, the water shortages, the electricity blackouts, the inflation rates, and what was going on across the country. And also, of course, many people who talked about how this war has now complicated all of that.
There's something you wrote about which I was struck by. The fact that women were not covered, that people were in many ways flouting the kind of religious prohibitions that had been placed on them. And it is part of what some people have been reporting, which is the sense that Iran has moved from being a kind of hybrid regime where the religious clergy had a very central role to a military dictatorship where the regime may now be more hardline and nationalist on foreign policy issues, but is actually less concerned about enforcing all these things like the veil and various Islamic edicts.
Yes, absolutely. This is something that we witnessed in many parts of Tehran. You had these two Irans that were living side by side, which was like, young women driving their motorcycles, not wearing the hijab, young men, tattooed, wearing shorts, smoking in the streets. And at the same time, you had like all the religious people who were, not missing any of the prayers, who were, chanting and celebrating Khamenei. So it was this contradictory Iran that was existing both at the same time. And some of the people who, were able to sort of like explain, how this came about, were talking about how the war had also created conditions in which they said that the government is definitely busy with a much bigger problem than, right now enforcing these edicts on the streets on a daily basis.
Given that you had this rare opportunity to be in Iran, would you say that you got a sense of why the Iranians are being so defiant, why they are willing to brave these terrible conditions, bombing and such, or is it just that it's a very repressive regime and the people have no say? I mean, what kind of conclusion did you draw?
I go back to the sort of like restrictions that we had on us and the government minders that were with us all the time. But even with that, people were able to talk about, sometimes even say that, yes, we might not want this government. There are like a lot of issues that are, not right with it. But so many other people that we also spoke to talked about, being wary of foreign intervention and other people coming in to like bring down the government. They said that they felt that, it was the job of Iranians to like do that for themselves and not some other power to come in and do that for them.
So a sense of nationalism above all else.
Yes, and a deep pride in their country. That's one of the things that I came out with from almost all the interviews that I did. There was this sense of like standing by Iran and being very proud of their culture and their history and this moment in time that is really difficult. Nobody talked about this being easy at all, and all the ways in which Iranians were coming together to stand by each other.
Well, fascinating reporting. I really enjoyed reading all your stuff. So stay safe and thank you.
Thank you for having me, Fareed.
I want to turn now to the curious case of Donald Trump and the catering truck. As you are likely aware, when the president departed the NATO summit in Turkey last month, he boarded an older presidential plane instead of the new Air Force One that was a gift from Qatar. But he was then smuggled onto a catering truck to a smaller military jet, which he flew on to the UK. What was behind this highly unusual clandestine action? It was reportedly in response to a threat against Trump from Iranian proxy forces. There's much to discuss on this with my next guest, David Sanger. He is the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times and author of many books about these topics. David, what is your understanding of the fear of Trump boarding Air Force One?
Well, the concern, Fareed, was that some Iranian proxy group, or maybe Iranians themselves, could try to take down Air Force One with a shoulder-fired missile. And it looks like at least some of this intelligence came from the Israelis. From what we can tell, American intelligence agencies had relatively low confidence in its reliability, but you don't take chances with the president's life.
So this concern about Iran wanting to assassinate the American president and high-level American leaders, correct me if I'm wrong, but it all begins in Trump's first term when the United States assassinates Iran's essentially the head of the Iranian military, Qasem Soleimani, right?
That's right. After the Soleimani assassination, there were various Iranian plots, fortunately none came to fruition, to try to assassinate the president. So the fact of the matter is, there's nothing new in the Iranians wanting to take the president's life. And that probably added to the Secret Service's decision to be extra cautious. And I don't know anybody who's faulting them for that. It's actually the decoy plane and putting other lives at risk that people are beginning to question.
And in the context of the current war, obviously, I'm assuming from the Iranian point of view, the United States and Israel have collectively, in a sense, assassinated most of Iran's top leadership, including the supreme leader, including dozens of senior Iranians, and this is payback. But what I wonder about is assassinations are very hard to do. Are there other things the Iranians could be trying to do that we should be worried about?
Well, certainly we've seen a big one, Fareed, in the considerable evidence that the Iranians have used cyber techniques to get into the municipal water systems run across the United States. We know of about a dozen states right now that seem to have had some level of intrusion and manipulation by Iranian cyber teams. The US government has tentatively, but not definitively, associated this with the cyber operators of the IRGC. And that, in many ways, is more worrisome because, there's a lot of protection around the president. And obviously, it would be a huge, huge issue if there was an assassination attempt or, God forbid, worse, against the US president. But it's a much harder thing to defend the 51,000 municipal water supplies around the United States, many of which barely have security budgets at all.
And, what I worry about is for the Iranians, this is an existential war, right? Like they view this as either they're going to survive this or this regime will collapse. And so you could imagine them being willing to go to extreme measures. Is there your sense that anybody in the administration is thinking about that? The Iranians have done things they've never done before, right? Like close the Strait of Hormuz. They'd never dared do that. And if pressed more, they might do the kind of things you're describing, even though they've never dared to do it so far.
There is the fear that we have a lack of imagination about how the Iranians can reach us. Obviously, their missile capability cannot reach the United States or anywhere close. The cyber attacks, that's a different story, Fareed, because as early as 2013, there was evidence and ultimately an indictment of a attempted cyber attack on a dam in Westchester County, New York. I knew it well because as a kid growing up in that area, we used to play on this dam. I could have told the Iranians there's not much water behind it. But it was pretty shocking that they got into it. And the fact of the matter is that should have been a big warning sign to us. During the Biden administration, there was a big effort to try to provide funding for some of these municipalities to do at least basic cyber forensics and cyber protection. I'm not sure how far that got, but the Trump administration has pretty well disassembled the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, part of DHS, that is supposed to handle these kinds of things. And so you're worried about it because, frankly, it's not a fair fight to put a municipality up against a state actor like Iran.
On that sobering note, David Sanger, always good to hear from you.
Great to be with you, Fareed.